Oh, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the RSA. My name is Ian King. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Business and City Editor of The Times, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here to today's special lunchtime event. Now, before we begin, usual housekeeping regulations. If anyone with a mobile phone could please switch it to silent or off. We're also live streaming today's event as usual, so welcome to all of our web listeners, wherever you are around the world. Can you hear us, Zanzibar? A reminder for those of you who are on Twitter, and if you want to get involved in this, the hashtag is hashtag RSA Business, if you want to get involved here. So as you know, we're here to discuss this book by Lucy Parker and John Miller, Everybody's Business. I have actually had a chance to read more of it than you might have thought, actually. So heartily recommend it. I mean, there are an awful lot of books published every year about business, and unfortunately, most of them seem to cross my desk at one stage or another. But this really is a very interesting read indeed. What really brings it to life, I shouldn't give away John and Lucy's speech here, but it is the case studies. I mean, case studies bring to life any number. You can talk about theories all you like, but it's the case studies that really bring to life a subject and help illustrate it for the reader. And this book is chock full of them, so I recommend it to you on that basis. So a little bit about our speakers today, Lucy Parker and John Miller. Lucy began her working life as a BBC documentary maker, making programmes about social issues, and this led her to take her filmmaking skills into the business arena, helping companies to tell their story, from breweries in Russia to copper mines in Chile. And she led the Prime Minister's task force on talent and enterprise under Gordon Brown to promote the significance of skills to growth in the global economy. And crikey, that's a hot topic today as it ever has been. John Miller has worked all over the world with global brands such as Coca-Cola and American Express in the USA, Asia and Africa. He then became strategy director for Mother, one of the most awarded creative agencies in the world, including Campaigns Agency of the Decade. I used to walk past your offices actually and think that was quite a fun place to work. John has created campaigns for many NGOs, including the likes of Amnesty, Greenpeace and WWF. It's wonderful to have you both here today, Lucy and John. So without further ado, they are going to present to you for the next 20 minutes. After that, we'll have a brief chat on stage, and then following that, we're going to have a good discussion, bringing in you, the audience, hopefully. So, Lucy and John.
Shall I give you that? Well, it's lovely to be here today, which is the day of the publication of Everybody's Business. We wrote the book because so many people have an instinctive suspicion, you could say almost an animosity towards big business. And in fact, it's become, in many ways, the dominant storyline about the corporates in the public arena, that they exist to benefit a small elite, not for everyone's benefit, and they exist to serve themselves, not the world. And we need to begin by saying that that's not come from nowhere. There are very good reasons that those perceptions exist.
We thought it was just worth reflecting, actually, on the extraordinary history that the relationship between business and society has. Dating right the way back to the 1960s, you had Rachel Carson, began by shining a light on the activities of the pesticide industry. And then there was the world was genuinely shocked by a succession of major leaks and spills, such as Union Carbide and Exxon Valdez, which many of us may remember, caused terrible suffering, huge environmental damage, huge environmental human toll as well, some of these big accidents. And then, of course, well known, the dark arts of the tobacco industry, which began servicing into public awareness. And of course, the story around sweatshop labour broke when parents in the rich world were horrified to discover that the presents they were buying for their children at Christmas time were made by other people's children in sweatshop factories under forced labour conditions, often in poorer countries. And meanwhile, there was a succession of major corporate frauds taking place, which brought down some very huge companies and ended up with their executives landing in jail. And we had people becoming very concerned about the sort of supersized health crisis, big food companies marketing to kids, profiting at the expense of their own consumers. And big pharma, this is an industry that's supposed to be making money by making people well. We're hit by a string of scandals, fabricating results, cooking up fake diseases, including people in trials without their consent. And of course, all of this is before we get to what the Sun calls the scumbag billionaire banking crisis. And it's not just that these guys seem to have caused the financial crash. That was followed pretty quickly by a string of stories such as rate fixing and mis-selling and even money laundering. And of course, new industries bring new areas of friction. So currently we have concerns around invasion of privacy, around the misuse of personal data, and the current area of real friction. The frontier is always moving. The red hot area at the moment is, of course, corporate taxation. And how can it be fair that these vast corporates are declaring billions in profit, yet seem to be paying no tax? And so all of these, of course, have been massive headline stories. And the public response to this has been captured, in recent years in slogans such as "We are the 99%." It seems often as though business really does exist just for the benefit of this small 1%, this very entrenched elite, and basically screw everybody else. And this has become the dominant narrative about big business in the world, and we can see why. But we don't think it's the full story. These big companies are huge concentrations of skills, of capital, of people, of resources. They can mobilize at scale and at speed. They can also be really big engines of positive social progress, we think. And that's why we wrote this book, Everybody's Business. If you want to fix the world, we think you're better off harnessing the power of these big companies rather than fighting it.
And to write it, we spent time with a number of big companies operating all over the world, some of them based in the US, in the UK, in Africa, in Asia, and across a variety of sectors. As you can see from here, high-tech, mining, food, drink, and producing everything from soap powder to microchips. And these are some of the biggest companies in the world. And you get a sense of how big these beasts are when you get close to them. Just to take a few examples. Unilever buys a vast amount of agricultural raw materials. For example, 12% of the world's tea is bought by just this one company. GSK produces vaccines at an enormous scale, dispatching 900 million doses around the world every year, 170 countries. BHP Billiton, one of the world's biggest miners, and they have one mine which produces almost 8% of the world's copper. At any given time, there are 400,000 people in the air on airplanes powered by Rolls-Royce engines. And Coca-Cola, of course, famously has a worldwide distribution network which serves almost 1 billion servings of Coca-Cola products a day somewhere in the world. So these are very big businesses. And we're in this territory precisely because it's these kinds of business that trouble people. And when we went out, we met people at all levels of the company, from the boardroom right out to the front line and out into the supply networks, indeed to the far end of the supply chain. And we talked to customers, we talked to their partners, we talked to their harshest critics. And so the stories we're telling in this book really are of real people in real businesses doing real things to try and affect change. And in writing the book, we felt that we were seeing very clearly why big business is everybody's business. And we think that there are 4 reasons. The first is big business, it's gone backwards. Big business is in everybody's life today. Every time we send an email, charge our mobile phones, fill our fridges, take a painkiller, have a shower, book a holiday, enjoy a beer in the evening, you can count on the fact that there are a number of very big businesses that have mobilized to make that happen. And our modern lifestyles are really underpinned by these big corporates. So we need to understand them as an integral part of society, not as something separate from it. Second, big business is everybody's responsibility. We get the businesses we deserve, you could say. I mean, we're used to saying that in the arena of politics or health services or education. We know that we have to get involved. and take an interest. And in writing this book, what we learnt is that you need to take an interest in companies too, and that they have the capacity to change and adapt once you engage. Third is, big business does need to work for everyone. We've lived through a time over the past few decades, I think we all know now, which really has had shareholder interest as the absolute priority for big listed businesses, and that's pushed to the margins a more balanced consideration of the interests of wider society. But what we found is that increasingly corporates are aware that their choices, their decisions, actually need to work for everybody involved. And the stories we tell in this book are of businesses which are consciously aiming to deliver financial value alongside, hand in hand with, social value. These businesses are trying to work for everyone. And fourth, we're asking a question. Can big business help to fix the world? You can think of a big business as a concentration of skills, of resources, of expertise, and these organizations know how to make things happen at scale and at speed, and they're waking up to their own potential to use this power to have a positive impact. And what we're talking about here really is about how businesses can add value by being a business. Often the traditional way of talking about these things is that you say, well, business is adding social benefit, and people imagine you're talking about the philanthropy, or they think you're talking about CSR activities that are considered peripheral to the business. What we're looking at is the core activities of a business and how it does business. And in this book, we see examples of many companies which are actually growing their businesses by joining the global effort to tackle some of the toughest challenges in the world today, which affect us all. And they're drawing on the resources and the capabilities at their disposal to ask a question, a very simple but powerful question: how can we help?
So we have just a couple of stories that we wanted to share with you now. First one of the striking things I think that we found putting this together was that very often the companies who are today's leaders in thinking about the role that their business plays in the world, very often those companies were actually yesterday's villains. They're companies that have had real issues to deal with in their past. And we think of these companies as having been on a journey in a way, and these journeys have got a lot to teach us. So this is the hallowed campus of Nike in Portland. And so if you rewind back to the 1980s, you have Nike was very much the kind of wonder child of American business. So it's this great, very aspirational global brand, come from nowhere in a very short space of time. And you had the CEO, Phil Knight, at the time, would go around talking about this as being a company with a purpose. And the purpose he would describe as being to enhance people's lives through the magic of sport. All wonderful stuff. But of course, looming over the horizon was a major controversy about Nike's practices in their supply chain. So back then, Nike already had as many as 500,000 people working in factories making Nike products, but not a single one of them was a Nike employee, and not a single one of those factories was a Nike factory. And so as stories began to emerge about sweatshop conditions in these factories of child labour even, Nike's first response to that was actually, they're not our factories. That's not our problem. That's not our responsibility. Which actually, if you think about it now, is quite hard to imagine a company having that response, which is a little bit of a measure of how far we've come. But the stories kept coming then. And they became really deafening. The public outrage around it became really deafening for Nike, and it came to a head in 1998. The CEO stood up, he gave a landmark speech at the press club in DC, and his message was a 180-degree turn on the point of view of the company. He basically stood up and said, this is our responsibility to worry about. We need to change this, and we need to set new standards for the industry. And his speech made headlines then because it was such a 180-degree turn. And so the company took on the issues. And it's become a familiar journey, actually, that we've seen played out many times since. But they began by saying, well, OK, we'll have a code of conduct for all our suppliers. But pretty soon they realised that actually they would need to work with their suppliers to help them implement this code of conduct, which meant they would have to partner with civil society groups. But in order to partner with civil society groups, they had to become a more collaborative organisation, which meant they had to embrace transparency. And so Nike became the first ever company to completely publish transparent details of its entire supply chain. It also led them to creating the Global Alliance for Workers and Communities, and the Fair Labour Association subsequently. And so Nike changed its point of view. But if you stop on that, Nike took responsibility for the issue. It's so interesting that responsibility now has become such a sort of vanilla term, actually, in business, corporate responsibility. But back then, it actually really meant something. And so, Nike founded the first corporate responsibility department. Maria Eitel was the first corporate responsibility senior vice president anywhere in the world. And the interesting thing for us is that once you take that kind of point of view on what is relevant to you as a business, what is your responsibility, you then start applying it to everything you do, not least to environmental issues. So over the years, Nike have become a leader in environmental issues too, and they've done something here quite radical. They've taken their product innovation department, and they've taken their sustainability department and they've smashed it into one entity, which they call Sustainable Business and Innovation. So they fused innovation and sustainability together. And most companies, of course, would typically do it the other way around. So, you design a product, you manufacture it, and then you assess it for its environmental impacts. But doing it this way around really means that you approach design in a very different way. And a great example of this in action from Nike is this, the Finite Trainer. So the standard way of making a trainer involves lots of moulding and gluing, and it creates lots of chemical byproducts and lots of material waste. Instead, this shoe, as the name suggests, is knitted from couple of long pieces of thread. And that brings together significant environmental benefits, as well as economic savings for the company, as well as it's lighter and easier to use. So if you're a runner, that's a good thing. And it's been widely recognised already, their whole approach, in fact. So this year, when Fast Company published their list of the most innovative companies in the world, Nike was number one.
And that is quite a journey for Nike over more than 10 years. The idea of business being on a journey became a very central theme for us. And in fact, we started to talk about our own book as a journey through the world of business. And we started that journey in Uganda. About 25% of the people in Uganda live in absolute poverty still. And they are struggling to survive, literally struggling to survive, on less than $2 a day. And what you're seeing in that landscape in there somewhere is mango trees. And that was of interest to Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola has a strategic challenge. There are fewer people drinking fizzy drinks all the time in our part of the world, and they set themselves a major strategic goal to triple the size of their juice business by 2020. Well, actually, that demands a lot of fruit, and actually more fruit than there is in the supply chain at this time. And that led to the creation of Project Nurture. And we went out on a road trip to visit Project Nurture. This is Coca-Cola working with 54,000 smallholder farmers across Uganda and Kenya. And this stated aim of the project is to increase the farmers' productivity and to double their income, alongside securing supplies of high-quality fruit for Coca-Cola. And to get a picture of what we're seeing here, to get that clear, these are very remote farms. This is halfway along the road to those farms. And these are very small holdings, some of them just half an acre. And often the farmers didn't even realize that their mango trees had any value to them. They would say, but everybody's got mangoes. Why would anybody pay me for my mangoes? And of course, Coca-Cola can't work with every single one of these 54,000 farmers. And so they have to work through an intermediary, and they engage TechnoServe, which is an NGO, global NGO, working on the ground with them in this part of the world, and they act as the delivery partner. And the first thing TechnoServe does is to form farmers groups into collectives. And there are now 1,300 of these groups across this part of Africa under TechnoServe. We went to visit one of them, the Nyoki Stores Farmers Group. The people crowded in, spilling out onto the road outside, because they wanted to explain to us what Project Nurture was doing in their lives. And through this project, they have learned to plant better. to protect the trees from pests, how to prune better. And they've been supported by Technoserve in actually taking their fruit to market, which means literally the closest big town, but it also means producing quality enough mangoes at consistent enough standards to get them into the supply chains of producers. And the farmers told us that only a couple of years before, the village was suffering from what they called biting poverty. They could not feed themselves. And thanks to this project, they've been able to lift themselves out of poverty. And they told us with immense pride that it's now them, the farmers group, that is paying the local teacher in the school. And they're very keen to stress, this isn't a handout. Nobody has given us anything, they said, only advice and information and connected us to the market. And the motto on their wall is, we gain by our sweat. They started in 2009 with 18 members, and as other farmers in the area started to see the benefits, they joined in, and there's now 275 farmers involved. And they're starting to save up for a pulping machine so they can get even more value from their mango trees. What you're seeing here, in effect, is an agricultural revolution happening in front of your very eyes. And the Nyaki Farmers Group, when you're in that place, seems a million miles from Atlanta and the headquarters of the Coca-Cola Corporation. But it is actually the nature of today's global supply chains, the biggest brands in the world connected to the smallest economic actors in the world. And one of the biggest questions for global business is, how can they act in such a way that benefits everybody involved all the way along the chain?
So in the book, we've got actually a couple of dozen stories like this. And what we found is that whenever you're talking about the role of business in society, you're actually only talking really about a limited number of things. The same 5 themes kept on re-emerging. And so we think of it as a kind of prism. When you're having a positive impact, when a company is having a positive impact on the world around it, what does it look like? And it tends to look like this, basically, one of these strands. First, the purpose of the company. What are you for? Second, the products that it makes. Third, the practices and processes behind making and distributing those products. Fourth, any philanthropic initiatives that it chooses to undertake. And fifth, the point of view it has on the issues that are relevant to it. So, first, purpose. It's interesting to see how a sense of purpose has crystallized in the big Silicon Valley companies as they become aware of how they're really shaping the world that they're in. You can see this in companies like Google, who came to define their purpose as to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible, or in Facebook, who described their purpose as to make the world more open and connected. But it's not just the Facebooks and Googles of the world, it's also companies like Autodesk. You learn about what these kind of companies do. They literally make the tools that make the world work. And of course, it might not be that the founders of these companies sort of set out with this fully baked sense of a social mission, but it grows as they recognize the impact. There's this sort of positive reinforcement that takes place as they recognize the significance of their work. As Zuckerberg puts it, building a mission and building a business go hand in hand. And it's clearly a good business. California is poised to pass Italy and Russia as the world's 8th largest economy this year.
And second, we have the products that a company sells. This, for example, is a jet turbine engine. It takes 18,000 precision parts to come together to make an engine like that. The dimensions are measured to an accuracy of less than the width of a human hair, and it involves hundreds of suppliers around the world contributing into that one product. But at a time when all of us know that aviation is the fastest growing source of carbon emissions, many of us might actually be saying, what a pity all that ingenuity is dedicated to producing an aerospace engine. On the other hand, it doesn't actually look like we're going to stop flying very soon. Most of us in this room, I suspect, do some flying. So we can either stop flying, or more likely, the solution is actually going to come from the very guys who have the expertise to build the engine in the first place. For example, every year Rolls-Royce dedicates almost £1 billion to R&D, the majority of which these days is dedicated to fuel efficiency. And if you look back over the last 16 years, this engine now is 16% more fuel efficient than the one when that program began 16 years ago, and it ratchets up year on year. So if society actually means to slow the rise of carbon emissions associated with aviation, it's likely to be exactly that kind of product innovation that becomes part of the crucial solution.
Third, we have practices, so how a company actually does business. So in India, Unilever took us out to a remote village outside Bangalore to see Project Shakti. So Unilever makes lots of products which many of us take for granted, shampoo, soap, washing powder. But in rural India, you can really see what these products can mean to people when you meet people who are washing their clothes with rocks in the stream and washing their hair with mud. And Unilever was convinced there was latent demand for these products, even in the very poorest people in the country. But of course, people living on a couple of dollars a day can't afford to buy a box of washing powder. Plus, there are over 600,000 villages in India, many of them very hard to reach. And so it was clear Unilever had to find a new way of doing things. And the first breakthrough famously came with single-use sachets of products to make them more affordable. But then they had to build a network to reach these people. We'll think of them as like Avon ladies. They call them Shakti Amma. They are trained, they're set up as small entrepreneurs with products to sell in the villages. Currently, they cover over 100,000 villages, reaching about 3 million households every month. And it's growing. So they're currently selling airtime in a partnership with a big Indian mobile phone provider. They're offering banking services to previously unbanked villages. And these women have become significant figures in the village. They're economic actors. They have a voice now. And so you've not only got a powerful distribution network for Unilever, access to products for the people in the villages, but also an empowerment network for the women.
Fourth, we have philanthropy. And though, as you can hear, a lot of what we've been talking about is the way a business does business and the products it sells and how it makes them, there is still a very significant role for philanthropy. And there's a new generation of corporate philanthropy emerging beyond just writing checks for good causes. Take the Thomson Reuters Foundation, for example. Reuters is well known as the biggest news agency in the world. And so the foundation has become a champion, really, for quality, free press, training journalists in war zones and in areas around the world where the media is challenged. Thomson is the biggest legal services firm, and they've created a marketplace to connect NGOs to pro bono legal advice, and they run information services on human rights issues and legislation. This is a much more strategic approach to philanthropy and represents a big step forward because it can make a bigger impact in the way it draws on the core activities and competence of the business. It's hugely motivating for the people in the businesses, and it's emblematic of the heartbeat of the business itself. It tells you something about what the business is there for.
Finally, you have point of view. So what's the company's point of view on the big issues that are relevant to it? And we saw earlier how a change in Nike's point of view was about its responsibilities in the supply chain, how that was really transformative for Nike. And this pattern plays out time and time again. In the book, we see how in the 1990s you had Big Pharma absolutely vilified for aggressively enforcing patents on HIV/AIDS treatments in Africa, even whilst millions of people were dying of the disease. So it's really striking to hear Andrew Whitty, GSK's CEO, spelling out a very different point of view. And it's actually worth quoting him. He says, we have to move from being a supplier of drugs to being a partner in delivering solutions. We need to stop saying it's not our fault, there's no infrastructure to deliver healthcare, and start saying who can we work with to ensure that infrastructure does exist. So a very different point of view that leads to a very different set of behaviours. And for us, this is the secret ingredient, actually. It's the element which is most often overlooked. The point of view, we think, is the thing which can most powerfully really connect to business, to society, and connect it to the challenges that it's most relevant to. And it's the thing that really has the most potential to break and remake a business model for a company.
And there are companies in all sectors who have been on this kind of journey of transformation, even the more unexpected industries like the mining industry. And indeed, there are some people who might be surprised that in a book that's about how business can have a positive impact on the world, that mining is featured at all. for us, that's even more reason to look at it. We did hear one senior executive in a mining company tell us how the point of view of the industry has changed and the journey it's been on over the past decade or so. There was a time, he said, when the industry didn't even know what damage it was doing in the communities or in the environment. Then the industry knew, but it didn't really care. Then the industry realized that it had to eliminate any negative impacts it was making, and now the leading mining companies know that they have to make a positive impact in the local areas where they work, or they lose their license to operate. And in a way, that's what describes the journey that business as a whole has been on over the recent decades. This isn't a static picture. It provides some basis, we think, for hope.
And so these are really all the separate strands of the role a business can play in society, and does play in society: products, purpose, practices, philanthropy, points of view. And taken together, we hope they offer a useful way of thinking about what can often seem to be quite a nebulous subject, the role of business in the world. For people in businesses, thinking about the role their businesses can play in society, this, we hope, is a practical way to get to grips with that. And for people outside business working to tackle some of the big challenges in the world, it gives us some clues, we hope, about how we might harness the power of these big beasts. But whether you're inside a business or outside of a business, we think this is about getting beyond whether it's good or bad, or whether who's to blame, or who do we point the finger at, or how did we get here. It's about recognising where we are right now and what's to be done. And we've learnt that what matters most actually is the direction of travel of a business. So everyone can see what the challenges are, and the question is, what's your point of view on that problem? So we think it's about looking at our business and asking, are you trying to be part of the solution? And why should we believe in this business? And that's what we've been trying to say in Everybody's Business. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Lucy. Having read the book, it's bang up to date, by the way. I mean, there are even references to the fact that GlaxoSmithKline have run into difficulty in China recently, so you really, really are up to date. One of the business areas that you probably don't mention that much, although there are a couple of pages about it, is the big bad banking sector. Why have you omitted them, and is this because they're beyond redemption?
Well, we agonised about this, as you might imagine. We have businesses from so many sectors featured as big stories, and we don't have a major case study on a bank, it's true. And in the end, we actually found that it was pretty simple. Because the point we were making in the book, or the point that kept making itself when we went to explore the stories, was that the way this works is businesses have to set out on a journey. And we found that really banking is only just starting on this journey. So what we do write in those few pages is about, I think, our empathy for the fact that a lot of people have a sort of fury about the situation and want the banks to say they get it, and then to start on a journey. And I think you could say that there are some that are beginning to say, we understand and would like to get going on this journey. We'd like to see whether we can respond to the challenge you're throwing at us. And so we ended up feeling, well, maybe if we wrote this book again in 10 years, we could tell you that there is such a story. But right now, we didn't actually feel there was that story to tell in this part of the world.
Yeah, we did bump into we met some very interesting banks in some other parts of the world, however. We were in Nigeria, and we met a bank called Access Bank, which was, it really helps you to see in a very different context, in a very fast-growing economy, what a bank can mean, when you've got providing access to banking to people, simply that, working with big businesses to provide banking facilities to employees and to provide credit to suppliers and to distributors, working with government to provide capital finance for big infrastructure projects. And this particular bank, Access Banks, are on a crusade for doing clean business in Nigeria as well. It's a reminder in a way that actually banking can mean something profoundly positive to a society. but somehow we seem to, have lost the clarity of that purpose in our own banking sector.
It's very interesting. So, actually, Anthony Jenkins, the new CEO of Barclays, I spoke to him on his very first day in the job, and he was very communicative about how he wanted to redress the bank's public image. And I said, well, what would be the textbook case for you of a sort of turnaround in image? And he actually said GSK, which you cover in the book. So I suspect you have at least one interested reader there. Obviously, the financial crisis has put immense pressure on corporates to be more careful how they spend money. There's been a good deal of cost cutting along the way. Did you come across much evidence of corporates paying less attention to what might be termed CSR, what might more widely be called giving more thought to their position in society and societal good that they do? Did you see any evidence of corporates reining in that during the crisis?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, there is a sense in which there are some corporates, without a doubt, that see this as a sort of peripheral activity. But actually, the companies that we're talking about don't. They see it very much at the heart of the business. And so, the people that we met were working on supply chain issues. They are the engineers and designers trying to create the new market opportunities. And it's very much about license to operate. It's about looking at business risk. So, I mean, there isn't a sort of yes or no answer to that question. There are, without a doubt, companies that will batten down the hatches and go, we just need to focus on the fundamentals. And other companies for whom this has become part of the fundamentals, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about that is you hear all businesses now, especially under pressure, looking for innovation. And the kinds of companies we're talking about in this book are actually, well, as your Nike's story was saying a moment ago, they're actually using that pressure as a trigger to innovation. And if you're using that pressure as a trigger to innovation, it may well be in energy efficiency, or it may well be in the redesign of materials and that sort of thing. So it isn't a trade-off. That's the key. For companies that are doing it this way, it's not a trade-off. Does the world pressure you? Of course it does. And the companies we feature, of course, aren't all companies. They are a leadership group. And one of the reasons for featuring them is to shine a light on what those things actually look like in practice in order to see whether we can't discuss how to make more of it happen.
Right. Devil's advocate here. Is it possible to overdo the attention as a CEO that one pays to one's business in society? Good example, Anglo-American, who again you feature in the book. Cynthia Carroll, I haven't come across a mining CEO who's been more committed to the welfare of her employees, the welfare of the societies in which she operates. She's more or less just been forced out by shareholders because the performance of that business has lagged some of her competitors.
I think there would be an open question as to whether those two things are connected. And that's an individual business and an individual circumstance. I think that really what was being looked at there in that emphasis on social value was the degree to which mining companies can find huge projects completely overturned by even a local community. I mean, one of the things we were hearing about as we explored the mining sector was something like 3/4, really, of hold-ups on big projects come from social disruption in some way or another. So is it vital to be focused on how you deliver value in your communities or to your employees? Absolutely. If there was a different performance issue, then that will always get you in the end.
And presumably, what sort of advice would you give for companies' positions in society? Is, as you say, it's right at the forefront. What sort of advice would you have for, say, the energy companies at the moment? They're obviously right in Miliband sites. The government is going to have to respond in some way to what he's done. Scottish and Southern Energy, they've raised their prices by 8% today. What would you do in their position? How would you advise them to get around some of the bullets that are coming their way?
They're a great example of a sector that everyone completely takes for granted. They're almost invisible, I think. And there's plenty of examples of sectors like this, I think. They could probably do worse than starting off by actually trying to articulate very clearly the role that they actually play in our daily lives, actually, and in the growth prospects that we have, economically and as a society. I mean, it's something that everyone completely takes for granted. I think would probably be a first place to start. What do we actually do, and how do we actually go about doing that? And you don't tend to hear that so much, I don't think, from the energy companies.
I think also one of the big opportunities there is, one of the things we're talking about is there are big challenges in the world, and what are companies to those challenges? Pretty much the whole world is hypnotized by the problems of being wedded to energy and fossil fuels and so on. And it's actually energy companies that are starting to turn their minds to how do we innovate our way out of that problem. And as John says, you hear very little spoken about from the energy companies about that, and they take a number, like you mentioned, an 8% on bills. There's nobody who's going to say it isn't complicated and difficult for people to handle. But one of the challenges for big business today is that we've actually let quite a lot of the conversation be hijacked by the idea that cheaper for the consumer in one area of the world is necessarily a definition of good. And actually, whether it's the supply chains of the fashion industry or other things, whether just reducing everything to how much we paid for it and less paying would be good for us, is not actually the conversation about the role of business in society. And so I think we're trying to open the doors a bit to saying, let's really look at what these businesses are as an engine in our lives and as an engine for innovation about the future.
Are there any sectors, I should probably say sectors rather than get you to single out individual companies or businesses, but there's just no point in them even trying to convince society of the good that they do? I mean, your presentation, you had a slide where the tobacco companies were mentioned. I mean, I've read British American Tobacco's annual reports, and they do talk about how, they try and source ethically, how they're putting money back into the communities from where they buy their tobacco. Are they wasting their time? Are they always going to start several goals down from the beginning?
I think that's about, if you think about the 5 strands we had, you have product. That's about the product. And do we think that the product has any social value? And actually, generally speaking, I think you look across the world of business, and there is genuine value in most businesses. Even in the hardest ones, the most controversial ones, such as we were talking about the mining companies. I mean, all our lives are underpinned by the outputs of the mining industry, So there are plenty of industries where your knee-jerk reaction might be, I can't imagine why you'd want to talk about those companies, where you actually look at what they do and they play a very valuable role in the world. Whether that's true for tobacco companies, I think that's possibly a question for each of us to answer individually, but I think that's probably the way to go about thinking about it.
And interestingly, one of the reasons that we found ourselves shaping the framework in the Prism is that quite often when you're having a conversation with somebody about the role of a particular business or a particular sector in society, you find that halfway through the conversation that people are talking at cross purposes. Somebody's talking about the product and somebody else is talking about the philanthropy, or somebody's talking about the processes and somebody else is actually talking about whether they have a point of view on the problem in the world. So part of the whole opportunity, I think, is to spread out the pieces a bit and say, which bit are we talking about? And when companies start on the journey of thinking this, they actually start an internal dialogue with themselves. And that's one of the most hopeful things about it. When Nike started on their journey, they had no idea what they were getting themselves into. And we've had a number of absolutely top operators say to us, when we made that commitment to make it better, we had no idea how we were going to do it. But it had occurred to us that we had to take this seriously, and we began. And once they begin, they suddenly see the next challenge and the next challenge. And as long as they take the point of view that stepping away from it isn't the answer, they start to ask themselves questions that become part of the solution. And that's a really powerful lever for change in society.
You've obviously looked at the way certain companies have addressed specific problems and challenges on reputational issues and so on. How big a problem do you see this tax debate to which you alluded in the presentation becoming?
The whole tax story just seems to be astonishing that it just keeps on and on and on coming, actually. And it's stories like this. These are really the reasons that people have this kind of allergic recoil when you mention the words big business, because of course the first thing that you hear when another one of these stories breaks is a statement gets issued saying, but we're complying with the tax laws of the countries that we operate in. But we've seen this pattern before, though, I think, played out a few different times in different scenarios. So when you had the environmental legislation, waves of environmental legislation in the 70s and 80s rolling out, you had an initial corporate mindset of, well, we're complying with the letter of the law. You know, we're meeting our obligations, market by market. But over time, what happened was that the companies that emerged as real leaders were those who would break step with that, would step ahead of this kind of compliance mentality, step ahead of we're complying with the laws and not much more. And setting new standards. These were the guys that set new standards, which subsequently became the basis for better regulation. And we're at the beginning of that journey, I think, in corporate taxation, because obviously you've got, you know, a business world which even in the last decade has become so much more comprehensively globalized, and yet a set of different jurisdictions on taxation that haven't really been able in any way to keep pace with that. Obviously, what's needed is global alignment on the subject. That's clearly going to take a long time, so I think we are going to see these stories repeating themselves for a while yet. The question is, I think, which are the businesses that are going to be able to actually break step on this subject and step ahead of the pack and go, we get it. We understand why everybody's worried about this, and we've got a new point of view on this subject, and we're going to approach it in a different way. That's, I think, what to watch out for.
They have to be very careful, I guess. I mean, Starbucks tried to do that, didn't they?
Yeah.
And it almost looked like they were making a voluntary contribution to the exchequer.
Yes, yeah, early steps, yes.
In an internet age, though, if one flips it around and looks at it from the point of view of the consumer, from the NGO, from the politician, maybe leave aside the politicians, but from the consumer or the NGO who wants to influence behaviours, is that harder when your target inhabits an online world? So, for example, in the old days, if someone wanted to boycott a particular company, service or product, they'd just stop buying it. And they could feel good about themselves, and they could badge the fact that they were boycotting these products. It's less easy when anyone can sneak off to the privacy of their own room and order something from Amazon.
You could also put the same thought the other way up, which is it's much easier in the internet age to mobilize against these big corporates. And certainly one of the things I think we found was that the big corporates are extremely conscious of the degree to which the public is talking back. And that's in many different forms. It's in, you know, customers crowding together to make a point. It's in NGOs being able to get their point of view out around the world instantly for no cost. So I actually think that the sort of push and pull of the way corporates behave is hugely influenced by the internet towards having to be in touch with what society thinks about them.
Right. Now, assuming that we ever get on a path to sort of sustainable economic growth again, I mean, it feels here in the UK as if we're sort of grinding our way out of the trough that we've been in for the last few years. Is there a danger that trying to achieve societal good is going to slip down the agenda as people have more money in their pockets and feel wealthy? I mean, it's easy to sort of pick on big business and target big business when everyone's seeing a drop in their living standards. As everyone feels more comfortable, is there a danger that this slips down the agenda at all?
I think there are reasons to be quite optimistic that this has actually become something that's quite deeply entrenched in a lot of businesses, partly because, you know, of the people that we met in those businesses at all levels of the company. I mean, they're motivated, yes, of course, by their own personal success and by the commercial success of their businesses, but they are also motivated by having a sense of we're making a difference in the world. And, you know, that seems to be becoming more and more of a widespread. I mean, it's not the majority. We're not at all saying that this applies across the business world as a whole, but it's growing, and those businesses seem to be the leading businesses. So, you know, there's reasons for optimism that it'll take root and become, you know, the actual dominant business mindset. Absolutely.
I also think that there's a picture in here which is actually to be less emphatic about the idea of social good and maybe take a fresh look at the idea of social contract. And one of the stories we tell, for instance, is that it's not many years ago since the fizzy drinks companies, both PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, which we feature in the book, were virtually pushed out of India. They were about to be pushed out of India because, after all, they use a lot of water, and they're using water there in a water-stressed area. And the local populations and the government woke up and said, we can't have you behaving like this. And they pushed them into re-examining how to respond on water. And now, 6 years on, actually both of those companies, but we talk particularly about PepsiCo, are absolutely at the forefront of water conservation and indeed water replenishment all over the world. And it's because they've had to take the issue on, and they've now got a really concentrated group of skills and resources dedicated to that issue. And, these big issues in the world, whether they're environmental issues or social issues, once you see them as part of your license to operate, it's not that you're doing social good, it's that that's your basic contract under which you're allowed to operate in society. And as these problems become more challenging, so society will expect them to behave like that. And one of the things we found ourselves often realizing is, as they realize their ability to do that, it becomes infectious inside the company. We heard a lot of very senior executives suddenly going, we've actually realized what we can do. And in a world where people are asking the politicians, really, what can you do? And how many of us could change the watersheds in a place? Actually, suddenly the actors, the doers, the implementers in the world suddenly start to look like you might find a lot more of them in the big corporates. And we need to be engaged with them about how they can help.
Okay. Time to throw it open to questions from the audience. We've got some roving mics, crikey. I think the gentleman here had his hand up first. If everyone could be kind enough to say who they are and where they're from, they'd also be helpful.
Hello, Jeremy Kaplan, Fellow of the Royal Society. Fundamentally, my question is, to an extent there was a discussion there going on about companies starting to do something, but isn't the fundamental point here that they respond to a stimuli? So you can talk about banks and you can talk about energy companies. If everybody just moved to another company, I mean everybody, so that the other 4 companies were out of business, the other 4 would do something different. And the best example I can think of is you can only hit them in the bank balance, and that's what's going to make them change their strategy. When Shell wanted to dump an oil rig in the sea, it's only when German consumers stopped buying in Shell garages, they decided to go and take it onshore in Norway and dismantle it. So it's all about hit them in the bank balance. That's the only way you're going to get a reaction.
Sir.
Michael Solomon from Responsible 100. I enjoyed your presentation very much and the discussion since, looking forward to seeing the book. I was a little bit worried, you talked about the cynics out there, I was a little bit worried that it may fuel the cynics to say, come on, pull the other one. Because if we listen to you guys and we watch you give that presentation, then we might think, oh, everything's good in the world, everything's fine in the world, there's nothing to worry about. But isn't this one of the big problems here, that it may be that all these positive things that these great companies are doing, while great in many ways, I'm sure you've evidenced that, may represent this sort of impact. And in terms of the negative impacts on society and the environment, it's something like this. You've talked about license to operate. I'm sometimes worried that businesses are doing this or talking a lot about this because that's part of the license to operate. They have to make profit. If offloading costs onto society and the environment is the shortest route to profit, and if their competitors are likely to be doing that, it's very difficult for them not to follow suit. So I wondered if you say just a little bit about that. And
Should we take those?
Definitely.
I mean, in actual fact, it might be sensible to take the first question and the third question together, because they sort of overlap in a way. They're a sort of question about motivation, actually. Why are companies actually doing this? And absolutely, as you put it, the bank balance. Yeah, of course, completely. License to operate, absolutely. I think for us, there are absolutely many cases of companies that have hit huge issues, whether that's consumer outrage for whatever reason, a massive license to operate crisis, and it's forced them to really get to grips with how they do what they do, and they've turned it around. And that's, the story of many of the leading companies. But it isn't actually the only story in town. The Unilever example is an example of actually a company looking at a market opportunity and doing something which has profound benefits to a much broader range of people, that's very proactive. And there are plenty of examples like that. In India, we spent time with a company called Mahindra, which is founded it during the Indian independence and works very hard to try and figure out how to raise livelihoods for farmers, and has become the biggest tractor maker in the world, in fact, by setting out with a positive mission. Or MTN, so the biggest mobile phone company across Africa. We spent time with MTN, and they said they got their license, in fact, initially to set up in South Africa because they had a social mission to get a mobile phone into everybody's hands. And there are now 1 billion subscribers across the continent of Africa, and they're the leading company in that. So, I mean, yes, it can be a defensive response, but it can also be an opportunistic response. So let's look at how we can grow our business in a way which is having a positive impact. And then the question about the leadership group, I think, is such an important question, because we are showing here the absolute leaders actually in this area, and there is a big rump of business that isn't necessarily yet on this story. And I think the hope very much is that if we show how it is completely possible to have commercial success, to be leading your sectors by taking these kind of approaches, then that will pull the whole sector behind it. We spent some time with Jason Clay at the World Wildlife Fund, who was very interesting in identifying the pressure points actually in how to create change. So he talks about how, for example, 25% of all commodities globally are effectively controlled by 250 big corporations. So we understand who those corporations are, work with them to try and figure out how are they doing business, what are they doing with those commodities. That's surely got to be a really powerful lever for change. So I think you're absolutely right. That's actually at the heart of this. How do you create the broader change, even if what we're talking about are the leading group of companies?
Gentleman there.
Yes, Paul Palmarosa, Director of Principal Business. When you were interviewing these leaders, did you discuss with them another P, principles, or values, especially ethical values, as opposed to business values? There was that book, Built to Last, which said the companies that really sustained had core values and they lived them. And I wondered what the atmosphere you found regarding that subject, working to principle, and then the profit will come.
Absolutely. And I would say that it would be hard amongst the businesses we spoke with and saw in action not to find that attitude. And in fact, when we were writing, one of the questions we were asking ourselves is, where do we put values in this whole mix ourselves? What did we learn? And I think that I've worked alongside and inside big businesses for 20 years. And one of the dangers of the conversation around values is that they are so thought of as enduring, and they sit on the wall and nobody dares think that they're not enduring. A lot of what we're saying really in that prism, in the idea of purpose and purposefulness and a point of view, is almost values in action in the real world today applied against the challenges. And that's why we've actually not spoken the vocabulary of mission and vision and values, but more, what are you actually here for? And when you see the challenges, what are you actually going to do? And so we've tried to keep it really, really practical. But I agree with you, values in action.
Gentleman at the back there with the glasses.
Thank you. Tim Johns. Lucy and John, you talk about a journey these companies are on. For many of the ones you've highlighted, it's actually a journey backwards. It's going back to where they've come. It's going back to Port Sunlight and going to building schools and hospitals. It's going back to working with the supply chain in a way which they wanted to build sustainable businesses. So something went wrong in the intervening years. One of the many things you can point your finger at is the role of the capital markets and the expectations, or the short-term expectations of shareholders. How concerned did you find CEOs about that when you talked to them? And how many, like Paul Pullman, for instance, or John Sainsbury, as I knew in the old days, were prepared to put the business and the customer first and the shareholder last?
I think that's an area that's evolving, actually, quite a lot. And of course, as you say, people like Paul Pullman have really taken the lead by saying, you know, if my investors don't like this approach, then maybe I've got the wrong investors. But I think actually partly what's happening here is there's less and less, you know, everybody looks at investors as this big lumpen mass, but of course there are many, many different types of investors, and they're investing for different reasons with different time horizons. And I think part of what we're starting to see is companies taking a much more sophisticated view of who those investors are and which investors are going to be with them, or you know, for the longer journey. So it's a changing picture, I think.
And I also think that what you're seeing is, you know, we've all lived through an era where a lot of CEOs of listed companies would quite comfortably stand up within a sort of bubble of saying, you know, our purpose, our job is to deliver shareholder value. And actually, I would say if you looked around this city, which after all has a lot of big global businesses based in it, it's quite rare to hear that now. You don't hear it. They certainly feel that they must deliver shareholder value, but many CEOs are much more confident about saying we have to serve the customer, we have to keep our license to operate, and if we do that effectively for the long term, you will get shareholder value. And that is turning, and people are getting more confident with it.
There's a lady at the back who's had a hand up for ages. I'm sorry we haven't been able to take everyone's questions.
Hi, my name is Nicola. I'm with Six Heads. I'm a practitioner in the space, and I've been looking for commercial solutions for social environmental change for quite a while. And recently, there's a charge that's been levied at me by various different people, and I find it very interesting in that people are saying to me, actually, by doing the work that we do, which does this kind of thing, what we're doing is obscuring a broader agenda. We're being hijacked by the corporates and towards their own devices and their own ends. And obviously I find this quite difficult. And if I think that we're working towards a radical change agenda, in some ways that's right. How do we actually speed it up? How do we not give some kind of stamp of you're okay to a company, even like Rolls-Royce, for a nice product, where they're not actually reinventing the entire way that the airline industry operates? So things like that. I wonder what you thought about that.
I mean, maybe part of this is actually about, are we getting them to be genuinely engaged with the challenges and to talk about the specifics of what they're being challenged for and what they're being challenged about, with a clearly stated direction of travel. Here's what we think about this issue. Here's what we're trying to do about it. And then it's kind of, it's less a question of, you know, are you for or against this specific business? Is this a good or a bad business somehow? But it's a case of going, here is this business, and here's how it's trying to change. And just being open about that and trying to take people along the journey with that. But yeah, I completely appreciate the danger, but that plays, it's a case of don't accept the premise. It's slightly reductionist, almost puerile to be playing into the whole, you know, these are good or bad businesses. These are just big economic entities, and we're just trying to point them in a direction that's positive broadly for the world.
I think also it's very interesting the way you put the question, because there is a caste list involved in these stories, by definition. And one of the things that we found really interesting is that we kept unearthing people working deep in businesses, hugely expert people who had come from politics or had come from the NGO sector. And there's much more a porous edge to these businesses than there used to be, as indeed there is in government, as indeed there is in NGOs. And indeed there's a sort of emerging concept of the tri-sector expertise, people who can work or indeed have worked across sectors. So I think it's not so cut and dry. In fact, there's an interview which we feature in the book with Jonathan Porritt, who many of you may know, who talked very charmingly about, when we began, he was saying, it was as if we had our lightsabers in the NGO world and we were fighting Darth Vader, And actually, as things have gone on, we don't feel that same way anymore. And actually, a lot of people have moved from the NGO world or the political world into the corporates because they want to get things done. And they say this is a much bigger platform for change. However, of course, this is a real question, and it's a real question moment by moment, business by business, and it's also where you can play best. Where will you, as your individual working life or your organisation, make the biggest contribution? NGOs aren't all the same, corporates aren't all the same, governments aren't all the same. And we definitely saw the power of the NGO sector. The corporates really engage with the intelligent NGOs. And some of those NGOs are implacable, and they want to be forever challengers and never working in partnership. And others go, well, actually, our job is to work in partnership and be a delivery practitioner on the ground. And that's not right or wrong. It's the best contribution you can make to progress and change.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that is all we have time for. We've gone over our allotted time, which is my fault, cardinal offence there. For those of you who didn't get a chance to ask a question, I'm very sorry about that. I think Lucy and John are sticking around for a while
We'll be
there,
here
so
if you want to talk.
you can get them privately. In the meantime, thank you all for attending, and please join me in thanking Lucy and John.